was trying to think about how many Tolkien-related books I actually had. Because I was thinking to myself, yeah, like it's not that much. I have the trilogy and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit, and then two other books up here with me: the Philosophy of Tolkien and Frodo's Journey by Peter Kraft and
Mhm.
Joseph Pierce.
Yeah.
And then I remembered all of the books that I had at home, and there are more.
How many more?
I think the total count is 13.
That's a pretty good number. That's more than the
Yeah,
whole How to Train Your Dragon series.
it's more than I thought that I had for sure.
Yeah. Well, that is fun. That's fun.
Yup.
And how much of them? So, and you've read them all, right?
I have. I think there's one that I haven't finished. That's the Tolkien Encyclopedia, I think.
Mhm.
That one, actually, I was walking with my brother in Costco randomly, and we happened to see it with a bunch of other books. And I fell in love with it because it had a really cool cover. And, like,
Mhm.
it was like the leather cover with the gold leaf on the pages, and, like, really cool
Mhm.
illustrations and stuff. So
Oh, that is
he
cool.
got it for me for Christmas, and that one is really good.
Nice.
Yeah.
And which one is that again?
So it's called the Tolkien Encyclopedia, I think.
It's Tolkien. Mhm.
So it
Okay.
has like alphabetized different characters and places and stuff like that it goes into. So yeah, definitely really cool.
Yeah. Sounds like it belongs on a Tolkien lover's shelf.
Yes.
Some people
I need
who might want to learn about this existence.
hmm I need to go back home at some point and get the rest of my books because I think my sister has appropriated some of them for her own shelf,
Okay.
and I will need to be rescuing them at some point once I have room for them here.
Yes. You're gonna get a bookshelf at some point?
hmm Maybe
That'd be
once I
nice.
actually get my own furniture.
Yeah. Well, that would be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, uh, I think we're at the point of introducing you that this is Lucy Cousino. She is a student at Michigan Technological University studying chemical engineering, but is an avid Tolkien fan. Uh, as anyone who knows her would know. Some might call it excessive, but those who
I
are Tolkien appreciators.
Yes, I am guilty of asking many people multiple times whether they've read The Lord of the Rings or not, because I keep forgetting who's actually read it and who hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to keep track. There's a lot, a lot of people,
I do know a lot of people.
and and now a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds when it comes to literature.
That is true. Yes. One of my favorite things at Tech is getting into discussions with people about Tolkien because some of them are very much nerds like myself, and some of them like know that I am a nerd and like to aggravate me because I get very passionately heated about things relating to Tolkien, and I almost came to blows with someone over it in a joking manner.
we'll have to address the question of names at some point. Write down your disclaimer. Your name will be mentioned in this discussion as a Tolkien lover aggravator.
Yes.
But yeah, so I understand that you are currently writing a blog post for your blog. Another thing, Lucy is the proprietor of the Path to Happiness blog. Am I correct in that? That's the
Yep.
Yep, Path to Happiness.
Yes, so that is the title of the blog, although the official website is lucycousino.com. That's LucyCousino.
And so you're in the process of writing a post, right? About about the very much stemming from Tolkien's writings and his worldview.
Yeah. So what I'm currently working on is a post. It's going to be relating Tolkien's writings to the feminine genius. So I'm in the middle of reading a book right now, actually by JP2, which is his letter on the dignity and vocation of women. And so that's gotten me thinking quite a bit about the topic. And I realized the way Tolkien writes his female characters is very different than most fantasy authors, because you have a lot of books that I've read, especially fantasy books, they have typically a male lead who's off like doing some whatever adventuring that he's doing. And then there's very often this female side character who she like the whole concept of her, I guess, is that she has to like she's either fighting with the man or she has to like prove herself by like being some sort of like magic or fighting or like aggressive. Like she's written with very masculine traits. Or there's this notion that she has to be masculine in order to be accepted by either the society in the book or even the reader. And that's obviously not a very healthy way of viewing the feminine genius, because that's something I think we see a lot in society too, is that women are valued only if they possess masculine traits. And that's not like, I know that can be taken very wrongly, but it's,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like women are valued if they like step outside the home and like get a job and like be this like corporate person or like be aggressive and like all that stuff. And I'm not saying anything against women who do that, because I'm also a woman who is pursuing a corporate lifestyle, but there
Mm-hmm.
there's a real value in the feminine traits. Like, and I think Tolkien writes that really well, because his female characters, they're not the ones doing all the sword fighting. They're not the ones who are leading armies into battle, but they possess a power and a grace that really it really shows itself in their femininity. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah,
Or like
I
you
think so.
have characters like Galadriel. Yeah, you have characters like Galadriel who like she's incredibly powerful. You see it like the way that she's able to guard her realm and to like she has these gifts of healing and these gifts of power that she has, but it's not coming from like she's not like defending her borders by like armies or warfare. Like there's a very feminine grace to it. Like and and her realm itself is it's a realm for healing and for growth. And I think that's a very feminine trait as well. The ability to nurture and to grow and to multiply. And so yeah, I think that's really cool about Tolkien is he understands the feminine genius very well, and he's able to write it in a way that his female characters are powerful in their own right without having to be masculine. Does that make sense?
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that you even see how well he develops his characters. I mean, also in his men, that like his women are very feminine, and his men are even more are like I think they're more masculine than a lot of other characters in other genres, liter other literature, because he doesn't try and blur things. He's very good at making a good and balanced view of what is masculinity, what is femininity, what is a how do you portray a man as a manly man? How do you portray a woman as a good and very feminine woman without just being just vulnerable?
Right. Like none of his women are really damsels in distress either.
Right.
They're certainly not weak.
No. And that's something that he did a really good job with. So
And I guess that's another thing I love about Tolkien too is his writings. Like they really show like a mirror of ourselves. Because I guess the like Tolkien's characters, they're not symbolic in a restrictive way. It's like he's very famously against any sort of formal allegory in his writings.
yep.
And that
Mm-hmm.
is and it's the difference between like you have a character like Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia who very clearly is Jesus. Like he's not just meant to remind you of Jesus or like be Christ-like in any way. Like
Mm-hmm.
Aslan is Jesus.
Yep.
But then you have characters like Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, where he does exhibit some Christ-like traits. Like he is a king. He is like the gosh, now I'm forgetting all of them. Or like any take a character like Frodo, for example. Like Frodo is a Christ-like figure in that he's carrying this ring up to Mount Doom in order to destroy it. And that can be reckoned to Christ carrying his cross in order to destroy the powers of sin and death. But Frodo is not Christ.
Right.
Frodo is Frodo.
Mm-hmm.
And we can also and the reason why I think that's so worthwhile to Tolkien's writings is that we can look at these characters and like, on the surface level, the character is just a character. Like
Mm-hmm.
Frodo is Frodo, and you can look at Frodo as being Frodo and not go anywhere deeper with that. But then you can also look at these characters and you can see so much depth to them and so much richness that's just reflected back in your own experiences. Because like you can look at Frodo and you can see Christ, but he's also you can look at Frodo and you can see yourself as well because you yourself are also carrying this burden of sin that is taking your whole life's journey is to carry this burden and ultimately be rid of it. And and you see that in so many other of his characters as well, which I think is super cool.
Yeah. And it's so impressive how he's able to, like, you started out with you can see that Frodo is just Frodo, but he's a good Frodo. He does a very good job of being Frodo. It's not like he's not two dimensional in the slightest. Uh, not just the mirror. Like he's his own person.
Right.
I think that it kind of addresses how it kind of comes to a little bit of how I think that some people say, like, I think that Joseph Pierce says that uh, a lot of Tolkien's writings or a lot of the things in his writing are more real than real life.
Yeah. No, I definitely see that. 'Cause- And Tolkien, he knew a lot of fairy stories as well. He was very interested in those and studied them quite a bit. And he really pulls this from those stories, I think, because they they take all the truths of reality out of the mundane, like day-to-day life that we experience, and they show us these truths in a way that we would never have seen them otherwise, just going about our lives.
Yeah.
There's a fabulous quote from him that I don't remember about that, but
Gonna go find it
yeah,
immediately afterwards, and yeah.
yes, I will. Yeah, like these stories, like there's so much truth and goodness and beauty in them that is present in our world, but I don't think we're trained to recognize it in the way that we should. And so these stories, they draw you in to the story, and then in following along, you just get so much of this goodness that almost like sneaks into your mind without you noticing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there's not really an intrinsic like message to it. I think Tolkien was very against that actually, like writing with a specific moral purpose in mind.
Mm-hmm.
But just the worldview that he writes in contains so much extra stuff to it that like you get to know his worldview and you get all the goodness that is contained within it without feeling like there are morals being forced upon you.
Right. I think that's something that's so very needed in today's world, because we have a lot of we've got a lot of people who just aren't in that worldview. And so Tolkien does a wonderful job of just being a channel of that worldview that he's been given. Like, it's not like he's not coming up uh with all the messages that were in there. He's there's a very like he's coming up with a lot of the characters and kind of the world that it is set in, but the story, and I think that he also talks about that, how it just kind of comes to him. It's like the story writes itself. He would be introduced to characters rather than write them in, but it comes not from him, but from his worldview that had been given, that he inherited. And so many people are now deprived of that worldview.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what's really genius about it is so so Tolkien's worldview definitely influenced the things that he wrote. He says that calls The Lord of the Rings a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing, but consciously in the revision. But if you read it, there's no religious element to it whatsoever. So you can read it, and if you have no understanding of the Catholic worldview, like you don't read it and immediately think Catholicism. Like there's no mass, there's no real religious worship of any kind. So you can read it as really anyone and
Mhm.
appreciate the plot, appreciate the characters, appreciate the world building, and not feel like there's this like message being forced on you, which I've kind of felt that from a couple other more Christian Catholic fantasy books that I've read, where it's like there's very clearly a message here. There's very clearly this like biblical symbolism. But with Tolkien, you that's a lot harder to find, which I think is really good for anyone who may be less inclined towards the Catholic worldview, where
Right.
they, yeah, yeah, like they can still read it and kind of get to know it without having it being forced upon them.
Right. And the more and more that our world becomes, our culture becomes anti-Christian, the more and more you see how how valuable that is. As we need more and more subtle ways to introduce people to the faith, because there's gaining more and more a kind of prejudice in the on social media and across the internet, uh, as the world becomes more, or as our culture becomes more polarized, because of course Catholic media is also growing, and it's and the Catholic sphere is kind of condensing, I would say, um, into a more and more concentrated Catholicism, which is very rich. But once you leave that, you kind of come to a very anti-Christian, anti-Catholic culture, and Tolkien's writings appear to be a wonderful way to bridge that, especially among people who are very nerdy and really like to get into that.
Yeah, and I think there's so much value in the books, whether it's like philosophical, political, like just moral even. Like there's a lot of truth and goodness and beauty there that you don't see in many other books, and you see it a little bit in the movies, but then not there's so much that you're missing there. And so that's why like I really encourage pretty much everyone I meet to read these books because there's like you can get so much out of them that you would have to go to so many other sources for otherwise. And it's written in a format that it can be a little slow to get into at first. I know a lot of people make it through the first like 90 pages and then quit because they're expecting it to be more of an action book where like they because other fantasy books kind of like try and draw you into the action right away and Tolkien definitely doesn't do that. So you have to kind of be prepared to have it be slower, but definitely like when you're reading it, like take your time, like really dive into like the goodness and like the depth of the narrative because I think there's so much in there to get out of. And like I probably read it like 6 or 7 times now, and I still pick up new things more and more every time I read. So yeah, I think there's value in the books for every single person, whether you're Catholic or Christian or not connected to that worldview at all. I think there's something there for everyone.
We were talking about persevering through the beginning of Tolkien's books, of the Lord of the Rings, especially. Um, and I particularly wanted to draw that into something we were talking about earlier, in how Tolkien's uh, his characters were so real, uh, and how they're very much a reflection of us. In that, part of why the early parts of the Lord of the Rings are hard to get through is because of how much detail there is of just kind of the walking, the daily parts, and just day-to-day things. Frodo waiting, right?
Yeah, I kind of think it's has a bit to do with like the richness of the narrative style as well,
Mm-hmm.
because Tolkien's world building is incredible, and he writes in a very descriptive way that a lot of people can find hard to read because there's like he'll spend paragraphs just describing the scenery and describing the characters and what they're doing, and yeah, I think yeah, there's so much depth to his characters that like even the littlest characters, even the littlest things, like he takes the time to give them actual lives. So
Mm-hmm.
they're not just this random guy who you see for a paragraph on this page and then you never hear from him again. It's like there's one scene where it's towards the beginning of the Fellowship, I believe, when the ponies are stolen from the Bree Inn,
Mm-hmm.
and you think that they're just gone, but then I think about a page later, Tolkien takes the time to actually write a whole paragraph about how the ponies are actually fine. Here's what happened to them. Like here's where
Mm-hmm.
they ended up. They were perfectly fine, happy, healthy. No need to worry about them.
Mm-hmm.
And he does
Like,
that for so many other places too.
mm-hmm. And like he has concern for his world, and is he really tends to it well.
Yeah, and that's like because his story isn't just focused on like the bigger characters. Like it's not just on the 9 members of the Fellowship. It's not just about like the kings and the wizards and the wars and all of that. Like Tolkien is very concerned with the little people, and
Yes.
that is both figurative and literal because some of those are hobbits. But
Mm-hmm.
like he gives each of his characters, no matter whether they're very concerned with the narrative or whether they're just this character who popped in for a couple pages, like they they have their own lives, and Tolkien really shows that superb way. I think you see that especially with the Shire and the hobbits there, because Tolkien he goes out of his way to give you like all the details of their lives, even in the prologue where he like you open it up and the first thing you see is concerning hobbits, and it's just
Mm-hmm.
this almost like a descriptive essay of just what life in the Shire is like.
Yeah. And isn't that just
And I think
wonderfully
that
reflective of his worldview? I mean, most people in the world are little people. They're not they're not big important people. And clearly Tolkien did not just see the big events, the big people as the important ones. He clearly saw something that I think we all have that kind of that understanding of, but also a lot of people struggle with that. Like they're important. People are everyday people are important, and most people are
yeah,
everyday people.
yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. Because Tolkien, I think he actually saw himself as a hobbit in all but size.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful quote about that that I don't know off the top of my head, but definitely look that one up.
Mm-hmm.
Where yeah, like he likes the smaller things of life, and he sees himself as one of the smaller people. But his whole story is about how even the smallest people, like they still have a job to play. They still have
Mm-hmm.
like this journey that we all have to go on. This journey to rid ourselves of sin. And and we may be small and inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but even the smallest people have the power to shape events that are way beyond what they could imagine. And Tolkien really does a good job of showing that.
He
He
does.
takes Sam, who's like this little country bumpkin kind of figure. Like he's very, very rough around the edges, not very educated. Like he's just a simple gardener. And Sam gets to go on this whole huge adventure with Frodo, this journey. And it's ultimately Sam at the end who, if Sam wasn't there for Frodo, Frodo would not have made it. Like we see Sam carrying Frodo up the mountain. We see him being the leader when Frodo is unable to really think or make decisions for himself. We see Sam being like that beacon of hope to Frodo. And I think that's so important for all of us to see because like even if like we might think that we're nothing special. Like we see ourselves as being like not that important. We're not that smart, we're not that wise, we're not so on and so forth. But like we each have a job to play. And even if we're just doing this little thing, like that it can have monumental consequences.
Yeah. And that really does tie into the theme of the name of this podcast, of Salt the Earth. That we so I mean in Matthew 5:13 we're called the salt of the earth. And part of the connection that I try to draw here is that if you look back in Exodus 30:35, there's the description of how incense is made, and in the incense is the salt. There is salt that is used there, um, and it's specifically the kind of salt that they would have found, that they would have used for their food, what the Israelites would have used typically, which is typically called actually the salt of the earth. And drawing that all to Revelation chapter 8, there's this great imagery of the angel taking the censer and uprising from the altar of incense is smoke that is called the prayers of the faithful. And then the angel takes the censer and throws it on the earth, and there's all sorts of great signs. And I think that really ties in perfectly with what we're saying here, that this is what God does. This is what Tolkien saw. And even though he didn't write it so explicitly into his work, that's what his worldview is. That's the Catholic worldview, that God uses us to create all these big signs, even just the little everyday people.
Yes. Like that reminds me once again of another scene where Frodo and Gandalf are talking. I believe this is the chapter called The Shadow of the Past, where they're talking about the ring and the history of it. Gandalf is explaining this to Frodo, and they're talking about how Bilbo came to find the ring. And Gandalf says that there are multiple powers at work. Like there's the dark power, which is seeking to find the ring, but there's this different power that means Bilbo to find the ring, and means Frodo to then have it. And Tolkien never mentions that again. Like it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it, but it's such a reminder of like there's this whole worldview here behind the Lord of the Rings that is Christian. It is religious. There is a power at work in the world that is working for good, and we know that power to be God. And you see that actually if you read the Silmarillion, Tolkien goes a lot deeper into that side of things as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, he sneaks these little elements in so masterfully.
And that's such a real talent, that the subtlety that he weaves into his story. That like that it's an incredible talent. It's certainly a gift. And you know that he would have just not denied it, but really it's like, it's not me though. Would have had a humility about it. And I think that that's what we're all called to have, is for all our gifts, of course, is yeah, it's just
Yeah,
a gratitude.
definitely. Your mention of humility actually kind of reminded me of something else I wanted to talk about too, because we talked a little bit earlier about the kind of the everyman figures within Lord of the Rings, and
Mm-hmm.
how Frodo is one of these because he's all of us. He's carrying this burden, this cross of sin that he's eventually going to destroy. But then Tolkien sets up this other trio of everyman figures as well that
Mm-hmm.
are inspiring and humbling when you understand them correctly. And that is, so there's a paradisal man, a purgatorial man, and an infernal man that he creates. And those are the characters of Faramir, Boromir, and Gollum. And so we see this with Boromir. Boromir is really all of us. Like
Mm-hmm.
he is a repentant sinner who is trying to be a saint. And he's really, so in the Fellowship there are two men. You have Boromir and you have Aragorn. And Aragorn is, he's kind of an everyman figure, but not really. He's much more of a Christ-like figure because, and you even see this, he's hard to relate to because he seems to be more elven than human almost, because in the story he was raised by elves.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have Boromir in the Fellowship, who is, he's a man, and he is a very human man because he has these struggles, temptations towards the ring, which, and he gets a lot of flack for it. I know there are a lot of people out there that don't like Boromir, but Boromir is really all of us. Like he experiences these temptations, which do seem very reasonable, honestly, because he seeks only for the strength to defend his people, and he
Mm-hmm.
sees this ring as an opportunity for that, and so naturally he's tempted towards it, and he does fall at one point, but then he repents of it, which I think a lot of people tend to miss when they dash on Boromir. Like he has this fall, but immediately he repents of it, and then he goes and he what's the word here? Like as an act almost of penance. Like he goes and gives his life in the final act of love to defend the other hobbits, and he confesses it to Aragorn at the end of his life. So it almost makes like he has the three elements of a Catholic confession, actually, where you have the repent. He confesses the sin. He does an act of penance, and he confesses. Yeah, so he makes an act of contrition, penance, and he confesses to Aragorn, who in this case acts as a priestly figure in
Mm-hmm.
the person of Christ. So I think Boromir is, he's a good example of all of us. But then his brother Faramir
Before you go
is
on, I do
also,
want to get an explanation if that's what you mean by purgatorial man. So just kind of to
Yeah,
clarify those terms of paradisial, or what was the phrase? Or what was the term?
yeah. I think paradisial, purgatorial, and infernal.
Mm-hmm. Respectively, Faramir, Boromir, and Gollum. And those terms come from.
Those come from Dante, actually. I think
Mm-hmm.
where his Divine Comedy, he has the Paradiso, the Purgatorio, and the Inferno.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
And and then you were talking about Faramir comparatively.
yeah. So Faramir he's kind of like a saintly man. Like we you see that he is tempted in the same way that Boromir is tempted, but he successfully resists that temptation because he has a lot more humility than Boromir does, I believe. And so he says, like, I would not pick this thing up, like even if I saw it laying in the road.
Mm-hmm.
And so he resists that sin and is meant to be a model to us of that as well. And then you have Gollum, who Gollum is, I think, the perfect example of someone who is completely enslaved by sin. Because you can see within him, like, there's this deep divide where he hates it. He's repulsed by it, but also can't seem to get away from it either. And to him, it's his precious, which he loves and hates, and it's actually enslaving him and his mind. And yeah, like he can't get rid of it. He can't destroy it. He can't allow anyone else to destroy it. But he also, yeah, he can't live with it and he can't live without it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's kind of what we mean by the demonic and by hell, isn't that?
Yeah, yeah. Because you make this when you choose sin, it's it kind of starts enslaving your mind. I'm probably explaining this very poorly, but and maybe you'd be able to explain better.
No, I think you've explained it quite well. That this is that it's, I guess, to put it in more of the church's terms, because you're putting it in very much uh, kind of a literary term, literary
Yeah,
phrasage. But I guess to put it in the more the way that the church would put it, that the or theologians would say that the people in hell hate themselves, and they they're completely enslaved. They hate each other. They hate themselves. They hate Satan, and but they've completely rejected all hope, and they have no ability to get away from what they have chosen, because that's what Gollum did. He went entirely for the ring right from the start. He sacrificed his relationships for it. In Was it Deagle?
yep,
By killing Deagle, and he sacrificed his relationships. He sacrificed really his own well-being to pursue this lesser good that was just so irresistible to him, because of course he was weak of will. And he can't has no ability to get away.
yeah, yeah. And it really, Tolkien kind of plays with the symbolism here a little bit too, because in his works, light is very clearly good and dark is very clearly evil. That's why Tolkien is referred to as the Dark Lord. And we see that like when
Who is referred to
Gollum
as the
is
Dark Lord?
Sauron.
Sauron.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry. But yeah, so we see that like when Gollum is ensnared by the ring, like it literally drives him away from the light.
Mhm.
Like it drives him to go to these dark, horrible places underground. And after that happens, like he can't bear to see the light again. And he's terrified of it.
Right. Like what does he call the sun?
The yellow
I mean,
face.
the yellow face that it burns him.
Yeah.
He's afraid of it. The same way that the elven rope, which comes from beings who are just wonderfully good, and that also burns him.
Right.
And likewise, he hates the elven bread, which of course is its own symbol that probably not going to dive too much into at this point, but and he hates
Okay.
that too. We don't have that much time
That's fair.
because that could go far. We'll come back to that another
This
time.
is a symbol of the Eucharist. Anyways.
Yes. But yeah, he's just he's a very terrible symbol of what does fallenness look like at its complete level, the complete level of fallenness.
Yeah.
Because I mean,
Definitely.
we're all fallen, but we're not irredeemably so.
Right.
Gollum is, and there's
I don't know if he was irredeemably fallen
because and
before he
that
made
kind
that
of
choice.
right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. Before he chose the ring, no. But and even in the Lord of the Rings is kind of where I guess the Inferno man falls a little bit short because he's not. You couldn't call him quite in hell because he's still fighting a little bit. He still struggles.
Yeah.
But in the end, he wasn't able to escape.
Joseph Pierce actually, he writes about this a little bit, and he just started coming up with a new verb, which is to gollumize, which I might start using, honestly. Because like
Can you describe that? Yeah.
like whenever we choose to sin, like we're choosing that wretchedness for ourselves. Like we're becoming more and more like this shriveled creature rather than the beings that God created us to be.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Thankfully, we're Boromir.
Yes. We can all strive to keep being good.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think reading about it too, like we mentioned before, it gives you that mirror of yourself that you can look on. And every
yes.
time you read the series, it's another self-reflection. Like, okay, like who am I in this book? How have I been acting? How would I act if this situation was presented to me?
Right.
So that's another reason why I love reading it more than once too, because you get to see yourself in so many different places.
Yeah, that is true, isn't it? Now I have to go read it again. Read it like that.
Yup.
Yep. And hopefully hopefully everyone listening feels likewise. It's such a rich read. But
Definitely so.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, can we just take a moment to appreciate the world building too? Because
It's
what I
so
love, another thing I love about his writings is like, because most fantasy authors or just authors in general, like you you get this idea, like maybe you have an idea for a plot or some characters that you really like, and then you're like, all right, like I should probably create a world for this if it's not Earth. So then, like
mhm,
you create the world, you got to think about like the culture and the politics, and then maybe you're trying to like name your characters or name some places, and you're like, well, like gotta think of a language for this, right? So maybe you try and go dive into that a little bit.
or maybe
Well,
just a
Tolkien took
language sounding set of words.
yeah. Well, Tolkien took that and flipped it entirely on its head. He actually came up with the language first because he was a philologist, which was a studier of languages. But even before that, he
Mhm,
was fascinated by them from a very young age. And so I forget exactly when he started coming up with this, but I believe it was before he entered college. So he came up with this language first, and then he's like, well, I need a people to speak this language. So then he created the elves, but then the language to him was intrinsically tied into mythology. So he had to create this entire mythology for his people, for his language. And
mhm.
so that led to the creation of Middle Earth and the whole detailed history of it before he even thought to write a children's story set in the world. And you really see that like popping through the text. Like there's all these references to places and to characters and to things that happened like years and years and years before the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings ever took place. And if you haven't read the Silmarillion, you understand almost none of it because he doesn't really explain much in The Lord of the Rings. But I think that honestly makes it seem more real
Mhm.
because yeah, like when you're reading any like historical novel, it'll probably reference things that you don't understand.
But you could go learn about if you wanted to.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like it is
Read the
real.
Silmarillion.
It's such a unique mind. Such an that's one thing that just makes it so special for so many people. It's
Yes,
it's
definitely.
full. You know there's more than you know.
Hmm. Yeah. And the more you read, whether it's his books or books about his writings or books that have no relation whatsoever to his writings, like the more you read, the more you come back to it. Like you, there's so much more you get out of it every single time. Like I think I'm probably gonna read it like at least 5, 6 more times, probably more than that. But I think like, even if I read it like 12 times, like I'm still gonna pick up new stuff.
Yes. It's so unique. It's so unique to just his writing. There's very few people who have managed that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, any closing thoughts?
Um, read the books. If you haven't read Lord of the Rings, you should definitely read Lord of the Rings. If this episode hasn't convinced you of that already, then what I say in the next 5 minutes probably won't. But yeah, there even if it's slow, even if you get stuck at a lot of places, like persevere through it. If you get stuck at Tom Bombadil, so have a lot of other people. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Keep going. Yeah, like don't stop. It's so good.
Yes. Well, thank you for coming on Salt the Earth, Lucy. Where can people find more of your content?
Yeah. So I do have a blog. I write various things related to Catholic teaching and Catholic life. That is the blog is called Path to Happiness, but the website is lucycousino.com. So you can see more of my writings there. I also have social media that I post briefly on. So yeah, find me there. Just look up Lucy Cousino. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Always wonderful to have a conversation with you. And congratulations on being the first guest on the show.
Thank you. Thank you.